I'm going to show you how to place beads onto your knitting. So you can place a bead onto a stitch either before you work the stitch or after you work the stitch. So first I'll show you how to place the bead before you work the stitch. So I've worked up to the stitch where I want to place the bead, and I want to place a bead on this stitch right here. So I've got my bead on the crochet hook, take the stitch off the left needle, slide the bead down the hook and onto the stitch, and then put the stitch back on your left needle. Now I'm going to knit the stitch. So this is placing a bead onto your stitch before you work it. So you can also do the same thing and purl the stitch. So take the stitch off the left needle, slide the bead down the crochet hook and onto the stitch, and then place the stitch back on the left needle. So now I'm going to purl the stitch. Okay, so now I'll show you how to place the bead onto the stitch after you've worked it. Okay, so this is the stitch that I'm going to place my bead. So I'm going to work the stitch. In this case, I'm going to knit it. Okay, so now the stitch is on the right needle. I'm going to take the stitch off the needle, and you notice when I do that, the stitch gets really long. That's because the working yarn is attached to it, and that's okay. So slide the bead down the hook and onto the stitch, and then place the stitch back on the needle. So here I'm going to give the working yarn a tug, and that is going to snug the stitch back up. So I can also do the same thing on a stitch that I've just purled. Okay, so I've purled that stitch. Put a bead onto the crochet hook, take the stitch off the right needle, and again, the stitch is going to probably get really long. Place the bead onto the stitch and then put the stitch back on the needle. And then again, give the yarn a tug. And I've just placed a bead onto a stitch after I purled it. So you can also place a bead onto a stitch and slip the stitch, so you don't have to work the stitch at all. So I'll place a bead onto this next stitch. And then with my yarn in back, I'm going to take the stitch and then slip it from the left needle to the right needle. And then I can continue working. So those are some different ways that you can work the stitch with your beads, either placing the bead first and then working the stitch, or working the stitch and then placing the bead. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and also give this video a like. Thank you so much and happy knitting!